dignity of human life? Well, we see a campaign against even the practice of suicide. Now, this may seem strange. Isn't everyone opposed to suicide? Not so, actually. Ancient Greeks like Aristotle were against suicide. But others in the ancient world, in fact, believe it or not, had supported suicide. You'll recall from an earlier episode we talked about the Stoics. The Stoics were a school of thought that argued that the ideal human being should be so much the master of himself that he should be utterly unperturbed by outside events. He should be have complete mastery over himself and his emotions. He should never allow his emotions to get the better of him. Well, the Stoics argued that in fact suicide was in some ways even an admirable way to depart this world, because there, more than in any other case, the ideal man was showing that he was utterly unperturbed by the world, so much so that he, at the moment of his choosing, would decide when he would depart that world. How else can you see an even better example of the idea of the Stoic values in practice? I am so above other events in the world that I can even depart this world when I choose. That is my mastery over the world. That type of narcissism, in fact, informed the Stoics' views on suicide. And of course the Church had to say, this is not only nonsense, but dangerous nonsense. That life is something valuable, and we aren't simply to cast it aside on a whim when we think it's a good idea. In fact, a number of Catholics pointed out that Christ obviously disapproved of suicide. At no point did he say to his followers, listen, if the persecution ever gets too bad, you can just commit suicide. We can't even imagine those words being uttered. But there is the Catholic Church's emphasis on the sanctity of life. It is not to be disposed of even by ourselves, much less by some distant government or by some gladiator in a contest in the arena. Now, even beyond this, we have yet another topic that touches on the sanctity of life, and that's the subject of the waging of war. Because it was the Church who, before any other institution, introduced the idea that there actually could be limits on what is permitted in war, on the reasons you can go to war, and the spirit in which war can be waged. There was nothing that corresponded to that in the ancient world because they did not have the same spirit of respect for the sanctity and dignity of life. So this moral issue pressed specifically on Catholics. When we come back from the break, we'll talk more about the just war tradition. Welcome back to the Catholic Church, Builder of Civilization. I'm Thomas Woods, and we're talking today about Catholic moral principles that most people, non-Catholics included, have come to take for granted. In fact, so much so, they hardly even look for their source. But their source, as in the case of so many wonderful fruits of our Western civilization, is in fact the Catholic Church. And so we've looked at infanticide and gladiatorial contests, and suicide, and now we're beginning to look at the subject of war. The just war tradition develops in the Catholic world, perhaps beginning with Ambrose, but definitely beginning with St. Augustine. St. Augustine had a great deal to say about the justice of war. What's interesting to note, as I said before the break, is that there really wasn't anything like a just war tradition prior to Catholic reflection on the subject. And this is very much different from the views that we see in the 16th century with a famous political philosopher named Machiavelli. Machiavelli was in effect of the opinion that governments could not be held up to moral standards the way individuals were. Governments in effect had to do what they had to do. But the Church condemned that view and was condemning it as early as St. Augustine. So, for example, some of the principles that were laid out by Catholic thinkers, according to which war could be justly waged, were as follows. For example, St. Thomas Aquinas, in his famous segment on war, said that it's important that the war be declared by the pertinent authority. An individual on his own cannot simply go and declare war. It has to be somebody who holds legitimate, duly constituted authority. Secondly, there has to be a just cause involved. Any old reason for waging war is not acceptable. And there has to be a right intention. You can't go to war solely out of desire for vengeance or just for a desire for conquest. So in other words, war cannot always be justified. Just because a war is going on does not make it just. So St. Thomas set down these important principles. And then with the passage of time, we begin to get the development of the just war tradition in the Catholic Church even further. In the 16th century, for example, a great man at the University of Salamanca named Francisco de Vitoria had much to say on the subject of the just war. And a couple of Catholic historians have recently summed up his view, I think very nicely and eloquently. Vitoria, in effect, said as follows, that assuming that a prince has authority to make war, he should first of all not go seeking occasions and causes of war, but should, if possible, live in peace with all men, as St. Paul enjoins on us. When war for a just cause has broken out, it must not be waged so as to ruin the people to whom it is directed, but only so as to obtain one's rights and the defense of one's country, and in order that from that war peace and security may in time result. When victory has been won, victory should be utilized with moderation and Christian humility. Francisco Suarez likewise said, a just war must be waged by a legitimate power. Second, its cause must be just and right. Third, just methods should be used, that is, equity in the beginning of the war and the prosecution of it, and in victory. The reason of the general conclusion is that although war in itself is not an evil, yet on account of the many ills which it brings in its train, it is to be numbered among those undertakings which are often wrongly done, and thus it needs many circumstances to make it honest. Now, that is at least a brief taste of the just war tradition, and there are, of course, modern just war theologians who are trying to adapt this tradition to modern circumstances and continue to develop it. But the critical idea here is that states are subject to moral rules and cannot simply do whatever they wish. They are not allowed, for example, simply, for no other reason, simply to go out and slaughter civilians. There are rules on how war should be conducted, and that is because of the Church's emphasis on the sanctity and dignity of life. Now, I recall years ago, back before my Catholic days, I was a student at Harvard, and that is a whole other show in itself, what it was like keeping your sanity being at Harvard. But I remember one of my dear friends at Harvard. His name was Fred DeCaro, lives in Connecticut. He's actually designed my website for me for free, so I figured he gives me a free website, I mention him on television. Well, Fred DeCaro once said to me when I was still a Protestant, he said, he asked me why I wasn't a Catholic, and I gave some hemming and hawing answer. I didn't have any good answer. I don't know. I haven't thought about it. I haven't spent the time to think about it. But I asked him why he was one. Why are you a Catholic? And there are a lot of different reasons people could give for this, right? I mean, well, I was swept up by the Bible. I was swept up by the story of some saint. A lot of people prayed me into the church, or some argument convinced me, or whatever. But his answer was very simple, and I never forgot it. And it stayed with me all the way to my conversion. He said, because the Catholic Church tells us how to lead the good life. That's simple. The Catholic Church tells us how to lead the good life. Couldn't ever get that out of my head, because I thought to myself that what the Church teaches in so many areas is in fact challenging to us. And in some ways it's a real challenge to the baser part of our nature to live up to the great ideal that the Church